The helicopter's rotors cut through the Arctic air with mechanical precision as I pressed my face against the small porthole window. Below us stretched an endless expanse of white, pristine, desolate, and utterly unforgiving. The Kepler Arctic Observatory appeared as a dark speck against the snow, growing larger as we descended. 3 interconnected buildings, painted industrial orange against the ice, with a towering radio dish that seemed to pierce the grey sky like a metallic finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. My name is Maya Henderson. I'm 30 years old, and I'd spent the last 8 years fixing HVAC systems in downtown Chicago office buildings. The breakup with David had been messy. 2 years of my life dissolved in arguments about commitment and career priorities. The subsequent months of unemployment had drained my savings and my spirit. When the job posting appeared for a maintenance technician at a remote Arctic research facility, offering triple my usual salary for a 6-month contract, I didn't hesitate. The isolation seemed like exactly what I needed. The landing was rougher than I'd expected. The pilot, a weathered man named Rodriguez, helped me unload my gear with practiced efficiency. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, gesturing toward the buildings. "It's a long way from civilization out here." "That's exactly what I'm looking for," I replied, shouldering my duffel bag. Rodriguez shook his head. "Your funeral. I'll be back in 6 months, weather permitting. Don't miss the pickup." The helicopter lifted off, leaving me standing in the howling wind with my equipment scattered around my feet. The silence that followed was profound, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Dr. Eric Hahn emerged from the main building, bundled in a heavy parka that made him look like a walking sleeping bag. He was Asian American, probably in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep-set wrinkles around his eyes that suggested too many years squinting at research data. His handshake was firm but brief. "Welcome to Kepler Observatory," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We're glad to have you. The last maintenance tech left rather suddenly." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. People left remote jobs for all sorts of reasons: homesickness, personality conflicts, medical emergencies. I followed him inside, grateful for the warmth that enveloped us as we entered the main building. The interior was functional but comfortable. Industrial carpeting, fluorescent lighting, walls lined with scientific equipment and computer terminals. It smelled like coffee, metal, and that particular staleness that comes from recycled air. Dr. Hahn led me to a small office where a woman in her 20s was organizing files. "This is Sarah Chen, our data analyst," he said. "And that gentleman over there is Marcus Webb, our communications specialist." Marcus, a bearded man working at a bank of radio equipment, raised his hand in greeting without turning around. "Small crew," I observed. "Smaller than usual," Dr. Hahn replied cryptically. "We're studying atmospheric phenomena, aurora patterns, electromagnetic fluctuations, that sort of thing. The work requires precise equipment, which is where you come in." He handed me a manila folder containing my employment contract, a facility map, and a single laminated sheet titled "Rules for Arctic Observatory Personnel." I glanced at it briefly. "Never venture beyond the station perimeter after sunset. If you hear footsteps in the halls at night, do not investigate. If the temperature inside drops below 40 degrees, immediately seal off the northern wing. Do not make contact with local wildlife under any circumstances. All exterior doors must remain locked. Between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. report any temperature. Anomalies in the northern wing immediately. If you hear voices calling from outside after dark, say do not respond." I couldn't help but laugh. "Seriously? Those sound like something from a horror movie." Dr. Hahn's expression didn't change. "The Arctic is an unforgiving environment, Miss Henderson. These protocols have been developed over years of operation. I strongly suggest you take them seriously." Sarah looked up from her files, her face pale. "The last maintenance tech thought they were funny too," she said quietly. "What happened to him?" I asked. "Equipment failure," Dr. Hahn said quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just follow the rules." I folded the sheet and tucked it into my jacket pocket. After 8 years of dealing with building managers who insisted that obvious safety violations were just suggestions, I wasn't about to be intimidated by what were clearly overcautious guidelines designed to prevent lawsuits. The Arctic was dangerous, sure, but I'd worked in plenty of dangerous environments before. "Where's my quarters?" I asked. Dr. Han led me down a corridor lined with heavy doors. "You're in room 7. The northern wing houses most of the sensitive equipment. The climate control systems for the observatory are located there. That'll be your primary responsibility." He opened the door to reveal a small but adequate room with a single bed, desk, and chair. A narrow window looked out onto the endless white expanse. "Dinner is at 6 in the main hall." "Any questions?" I shook my head and he left me to unpack. As I arranged my belongings, I found myself repeatedly glancing at the laminated rule sheet. The more I looked at it, the more ridiculous it seemed. Rule number 2 was particularly absurd. Of course, you'd investigate footsteps in the halls at night. That's what maintenance personnel did. We investigated problems. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window frame. I pulled the curtains closed and finished unpacking. Whatever neuroses had developed among the previous staff, I wasn't about to let them affect my work. I was here to do a job, earn some money, and figure out what came next in my life. The rules were just paranoid nonsense from people who'd been isolated too long. At least that's what I told myself. My second night at Kepler Observatory began routinely. Enough. Dr. Han had assigned me to perform a systems check on the heating infrastructure. In the northern wing, a task I'd been putting off due to the unusual cold snap that had settled over the facility. The temperature outside had dropped to 52 degrees Celsius, well below the seasonal average, and the building's heating systems were working overtime to maintain habitable conditions. Gathered my tools and headed toward the northern wing around 11 p.m. The corridor connecting the main building to the northern section felt noticeably colder, my breath visible in small puffs, despite the supposedly regulated internal climate. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The temperature gauge mounted near the entrance to the northern wing read 38 degrees inside. I paused, remembering rule number 3. If the temperature inside drops below 40 degrees, immediately seal off the northern wing. We weren't there yet, but we were close. I checked my watch. The fuel delivery was scheduled for the following afternoon, and if the heating system failed overnight, we'd have serious problems. I decided to proceed. The equipment I needed to inspect was located in the mechanical room at the far end of the wing, and the job would only take 30 minutes. 2 degrees wasn't worth delaying essential maintenance. The northern wing felt different from the rest of the facility. The walls were older, constructed from grey concrete blocks rather than the modern insulated panels used in the main building. My footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow hallway, the sound seeming to stretch and distort in the cold air. The doors I passed were labelled with technical designations: atmospheric monitoring, electromagnetic research, data storage. All were locked. As I worked on the heating unit, checking pressure gauges and fuel lines, the wind outside intensified. The building groaned and settled around me, metal contracting in the extreme cold. I was focused on a particularly stubborn fuel valve when I heard them. Footsteps in the hallway. They were deliberate, measured, moving from the direction of the main building toward my location. But I'd checked the duty roster earlier. Everyone else was asleep, and Dr. Han had specifically mentioned that the northern wing was off-limits to other personnel during maintenance work. The footsteps stopped directly outside the mechanical room door. I stood quietly, wrench still in hand, listening. The building's heating system hummed around me. But underneath that mechanical noise, I could swear I heard breathing. Slow, deep inhalations and exhalations that seemed too loud in the confined space. Rule number 2 echoed in my mind. If you hear footsteps in the halls at night, do not investigate. I almost laughed at myself for remembering it. Whoever was outside was probably just Dr. Han checking on my progress, or perhaps Marcus doing some late-night equipment monitoring. The most logical response was to open the door and see who it was, but something held me back. The quality of the silence outside felt wrong somehow, too expectant, too focused. I remained motionless for several minutes, waiting for a knock on the door or a voice calling my name. Neither came. Eventually the footsteps resumed, moving away from my location toward the far end of the wing. I waited another 5 minutes before opening the door to look out. The hallway was empty, fluorescent lights flickering over grey concrete walls. No sign of whoever had been there. I finished my work quickly and headed back toward the main building. As I reached the connecting corridor, I glanced at the temperature gauge again. It read 40 degrees. My blood went cold. In the 30 minutes I'd been working, the temperature had dropped 3 degrees. That shouldn't have been possible with the heating system running normally. I'd just checked every component. Everything was functioning within normal parameters. I hurried back to my quarters, but as I reached the main building, every light in the facility suddenly flickered in unison. The temperature display in the main hallway showed 35 degrees C, normal for the heated areas, but still colder than it should have been. I turned to look back at the northern wing entrance. The heavy door, which I was certain I'd left propped open, was now firmly closed. And as I watched, frost began forming along the doorframe's edges, spreading in intricate crystalline patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The heating system's mechanical hum, which had been a constant background noise throughout the facility, suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear something else, a low, almost subsonic vibration coming from somewhere deep within the northern wing. It sounded almost like breathing, but impossibly deep and slow, as if something massive was sleeping just beyond the walls. I stood there for several minutes, watching the frost continue to spread, trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. Equipment malfunctions, temperature fluctuations, acoustic anomalies caused by the extreme cold. There had to be logical explanations. But as I finally headed to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the northern wing had been aware of my presence. Something that had walked those halls, stood outside that door and waited patiently for me to make a choice. I'd followed the rules, almost by accident. And I was beginning to suspect that might have saved my life. The supply helicopter arrived the next morning under gray, overcast skies. Along with fuel and provisions, it brought James Morrison, a 26-year-old engineering graduate from Minnesota who would be assisting with equipment maintenance during the winter months. James had the kind of confident enthusiasm that comes from academic success and limited real-world experience. As Dr. Hahn introduced him to the team, his eyes sparkled with excitement about working at one of the most remote scientific installations on the planet. During lunch, I mentioned the previous night's temperature anomalies to Dr. Hahn. He listened with a neutral expression, making notes on a small pad. The northern wing has always been problematic, he said. The original construction was completed in 1987, and the insulation standards weren't what they are today. We've learned to work around its quirks. Quirks? James interjected. What kind of quirks? Dr. Hahn hesitated. Temperature fluctuations, primarily. The wing can become quite cold very quickly, under certain atmospheric conditions. That's why we have protocols in place. I handed James the laminated rule sheet, which I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket. He read through it quickly, his expression shifting from curiosity to amusement. Don't investigate footsteps in the halls at night. Oh, he read aloud. Are you guys serious? This reads like something from a creepypasta. Sarah, who had been quietly eating her soup, looked up sharply. Those rules exist for good reasons, James. The previous maintenance tech died in an equipment accident, Dr. Hahn interrupted firmly. Nothing supernatural about it. But the Arctic environment can play tricks on your perception. Isolation, extreme cold, limited daylight, these factors can affect judgment. The rules help prevent accidents. James nodded knowingly. Right, like how sailors used to think they heard sirens. Environmental psychology. I get it. That evening, Dr. Hahn assigned James to perform a routine inspection of the atmospheric monitoring equipment in the northern wing. It was a simple task, checking data loggers, replacing batteries in remote sensors, ensuring that backup systems were functioning properly. Standard maintenance work that should take no more than 2 hours. I offered to accompany him, but James waved me off. I've got this. Besides, someone needs to show these rules who's boss, right? I watched him gather his equipment with growing unease. James, seriously, the temperature drops fast in there. Just be careful. Maya, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not going to be intimidated by a list of superstitious nonsense, he replied. The northern wing is just another part of the building. Cold air doesn't have magical properties. He headed toward the northern wing at approximately 9:30 p.m., carrying his toolkit and wearing a heavy winter jacket. I returned to my quarters but found myself unable to concentrate on the book I was trying to read. Every few minutes I'd check the time, calculating how long James had been gone. At 11:15 p.m., the building's intercom system crackled to life. James's voice came through, but it was wrong somehow. Strained, breathless, with an undertone of confusion that made my stomach clench. Maya. Maya, are you there? I need help. Something's wrong with the equipment. I grabbed my jacket and toolkit and ran toward the northern wing. The connecting corridor was noticeably colder than it had been earlier, and the fluorescent lights were flickering more frequently. As I approached the entrance to the wing, I could see that the temperature gauge read 43 degrees below the threshold. The rule was clear: seal off the northern wing. But James was in there. I opened the door and immediately felt the cold hit me like a physical force. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I could feel the moisture in my nose beginning to freeze. The hallway ahead was darker than usual, with several light fixtures completely dead. Ice had formed along the walls in strange organic patterns that reminded me of frost ferns or neural networks. "James," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the frigid air. No response. I moved deeper into the wing, following the route toward the atmospheric monitoring station. The cold was becoming painful now, seeping through my jacket and making my hands clumsy. More concerning was the ice formation. It wasn't just frost from condensation. The patterns were too complex, too deliberate, spreading across the walls and ceiling in spiraling designs that seemed to pulse and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found James's toolkit in the hallway outside the monitoring station, tools scattered as if dropped in haste. The door to the station itself was standing open, and beyond it, I could see banks of scientific equipment covered in a thick layer of ice that definitely hadn't been there during the day. "James?" I called again, stepping into the room. The equipment was completely encased in ice, not just covered but entombed, as if it had been flash frozen by something impossibly cold. The ice was crystal clear in places, allowing me to see the instruments underneath, but in other areas, it was opaque and seemed to contain dark shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. James's radio was on the floor, partially buried in ice. I picked it up, and it immediately began emitting static mixed with what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The voices were layered, overlapping, creating a susurrus of sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. That's when I noticed the scratches. Deep gouges ran along the walls, starting near the equipment and leading toward the exterior door at the far end of the room. They were too deep and too regularly spaced to have been made by any tool James would have been carrying. The pattern was organic, almost claw-like, but sized for something much larger than any Arctic animal I knew of. The exterior door, which should have been locked according to the rules, was standing open. Beyond it I could see nothing but swirling snow and darkness. I followed the scratches, my heart pounding. Outside, the wind had picked up to a howling gale, but in the brief moments between gusts, I could see something in the snow, a trail of disturbed ice leading away from the building into the darkness. There was no sign of James. His radio continued to emit those strange whispers. Growing louder and more urgent, I turned the volume down, but the voices seemed to continue at the same level, as if they were coming from inside the device itself, rather than through its speakers. I sealed the exterior door and retreated from the northern wing, following protocol by closing and locking the main entrance behind me. The temperature gauge now read 47 degrees, well below the threshold specified in the rules. Back in the main building, I found Dr. Hahn in his office, staring at a bank of monitors showing atmospheric data from around the facility. He looked up as I entered, and I could see in his eyes that he already knew what I was going to tell him. "James is gone," I said. Dr. Hahn nodded slowly. "The temperature sensors in the northern wing went offline about an hour ago. I was hoping he'd made it back to his quarters. There were scratches on the walls, deep ones, and ice formations that couldn't have occurred naturally." "Yes," he said quietly. "That happens sometimes when the rules are broken." I stared at him. "What happens exactly?" Dr. Hahn turned back to his monitors. "The cold gets in, and once it's in, it takes what it needs." The building's heating system hummed back to life, and gradually the temperature began to rise. But I knew that somewhere in the northern wing the ice would remain, preserving whatever evidence of James's fate lay frozen within its crystalline embrace. The rules weren't suggestions. They were the only thing standing between us and something that treated human life as nothing more than sustenance for its ancient, patient hunger. The morning after James's disappearance brought no rescue helicopter, no search team, no official investigation. Dr. Hahn simply updated the duty roster, redistributing James's responsibilities among the remaining crew members. And life at Kepler Observatory continued, as if nothing had happened. When I pressed him about contacting the authorities, he showed me a radio log indicating that he'd reported James as missing due to a weather-related equipment failure, and that search operations would resume when conditions improved. Conditions, he noted, were not expected to improve for several weeks. Unable to accept this bureaucratic indifference, I began my own investigation. The facility had been operational for 37 years, and if James wasn't the first person to vanish, there would be records. I started in the administrative office, searching through personnel files, incident reports, and maintenance logs during my off-duty hours. What I found was deeply disturbing. The pattern went back decades. Maintenance staff, researchers, even visiting inspectors. People disappeared from Kepler Observatory with alarming regularity. The official explanations were consistent: equipment failures, weather emergencies, personnel who had violated safety protocols during extreme conditions. But reading between the lines of incident reports, I began to see a different story. In 2019, maintenance technician David Reeves had vanished during a routine inspection of the northern wing. His final radio transmission, according to the log, contained unintelligible vocalizations consistent with hypothermia-induced delirium. In 2017, atmospheric researcher Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been found frozen solid in her laboratory, despite the room's heating system functioning normally. The report noted anomalous ice formation patterns, but offered no explanation for their cause. The most revealing document was a handwritten journal I discovered in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, wrapped in plastic and labeled Personal Effects, T. Morrison. 2021. The name was different, but the handwriting was unmistakably similar to maintenance reports I'd seen. So, previous maintenance technician, probably a relative of James, had worked here before. The journal entries painted a picture of mounting paranoia and dread. March 15th, third night of hearing footsteps in the northern wing. Dr. Hahn insists it's the building settling, but buildings don't walk in measured steps. Something is moving through those halls. March 22nd, temperature in northern wing dropped to 45 degrees AC today with no apparent cause. Found ice formations on equipment that look almost organic, like frozen neural networks or blood vessels. When I touched one, I swear I felt it pulse. March 28th, saw something outside my window last night, tall, pale, moving against the storm in ways that didn't look human. When I tried to take a picture, my camera malfunctioned. Screen showed only static with shapes moving through it. April 3rd. Dr. Hahn pulled me aside today. Told me the previous maintenance tech had gotten too curious, and that curiosity was dangerous here. Said the facility was built on something old, something that should have been left alone. The research isn't about atmospheric phenomena. It's about containment. April 10th. I understand now. The rules aren't protection protocols. They're a treaty. As long as we follow them, it allows us to exist here. But it's always hungry, always testing the boundaries. The cold isn't just weather. It's alive and it wants in. The journal ended abruptly after that entry. According to the personnel records, T. Morrison had requested immediate, a transfer due to personal emergency, and had left the facility the following week. I searched deeper into the administrative files and found architectural plans for the original construction. Kepler Observatory hadn't been built as a research facility. The original blueprints, dated 1987, showed it as a containment and monitoring station, funded by a joint Department of Defense and National Science Foundation project. The northern wing was designated as primary observation post, with walls nearly 3 feet thick, and specialized environmental controls designed not to keep cold out, but to keep something in. Additional documentation revealed that construction had been halted multiple times due to geological anomalies beneath the foundation site. Workers had reported tools freezing solid in temperatures above zero, equipment malfunctioning without cause, and several cases of severe frostbite among crew members who insisted they hadn't been exposed to extreme cold. The most chilling document was a geological survey from 1986. Beneath layers of bureaucratic language, it described the discovery of crystalline formations of unknown composition in the permafrost below the construction site. Core samples had revealed ice structures that appeared to be artificially created, extending in complex patterns deep into the frozen ground. The formations showed signs of ongoing structural development, despite having been presumably frozen for thousands of years. As I read these documents, the building around me began to feel different. The walls seemed thinner, more fragile, as if they were all that stood between us and something vast and patient waiting beneath the ice. The northern wing, which I'd been avoiding since James's disappearance, called to me with an almost magnetic pull. Late that evening I heard them again, footsteps in the halls. This time, I was certain they were coming from outside my room, moving slowly along the corridor toward the northern wing entrance. I pressed my ear to my door and listened as the measured steps paused directly outside, accompanied by what sounded like slow, deliberate breathing. Following rule number 2, I didn't investigate. But I also didn't sleep. The next morning I found frost patterns on my door's interior surface, delicate spiraling designs that hadn't been there the night before. They were beautiful in their complexity, resembling neural networks or blood vessel structures, but they were also impossible. My room's heating system had functioned normally all night. As I traced the patterns with my finger, they began to shift and change, reorganizing themselves into new configurations. For just a moment, they seemed to form symbols or letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. But before I could focus on them clearly, they melted away, leaving only water droplets on the metal surface. The facility wasn't just built to study something ancient and alien. It was built to contain it. And the rules weren't safety protocols. They were the terms of an uneasy truce between human ambition and something that had been sleeping beneath the Arctic ice for millennia. Something that was beginning to wake up. Dr. Eric Hahn found me in the equipment storage room 3 days after James's disappearance, methodically checking inventory against supply manifests with an obsessiveness that probably looked suspicious. I'd been avoiding the common areas, eating meals in my room, and restricting my movements to essential maintenance tasks in the main building only. The northern wing remained sealed, its entrance door locked, and the temperature gauge permanently reading 47 degrees Celsius, despite the building's heating systems running at full capacity. "Maya," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." Up close, I could see that Dr. Hahn looked exhausted. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes were bloodshot with the particular fatigue that comes from chronic sleep deprivation. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his hands shook slightly as he leaned against a supply shelf. "How long have you been here?" I asked. 11 years, he replied. "Longer than anyone else currently on staff. Longer than anyone should be." He moved to the room's small window, looking out at the endless white expanse beyond. "I came here as a postdoc, studying electromagnetic anomalies in the upper atmosphere. Thought I'd stay 2 years, publish some papers, move on to a university position. That was before I understood what this place really is." "What is it, really?" Dr. Hahn was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of accumulated dread. "Have you ever heard of the Tunguska event, Maya? 1908, Siberian explosion that flattened thousands of square kilometers of forest? Most people think it was a meteor or comet impact, but no crater was ever found." I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "There have been similar events throughout history. Unexplained explosions in remote polar regions, massive areas of land suddenly frozen far below normal temperatures, entire indigenous communities disappearing overnight in perfectly preserved settlements." He turned from the window to face me. "The official explanation is always natural phenomena. Aurora activity, magnetic field fluctuations, freak weather patterns. But that's not what you think happened. I know what happened because I've spent 11 years monitoring the source." His expression was haunted. "In 1986, a deep-core drilling project here hit something that shouldn't exist. Not oil, not natural gas, not any mineral we have names for. They found cavities in the permafrost, vast hollows that extended far deeper than should be geologically possible. And inside those cavities there was something alive. The temperature in the storage room seemed to drop several degrees. I pulled my jacket tighter. The drilling project was classified immediately, Dr. Hahn continued. This facility was built ostensibly to study atmospheric phenomena, but its real purpose is containment and observation. We monitor something that has been dormant beneath the Arctic ice for thousands of years, something that feeds on heat and life and grows stronger with each feeding. The rules, I said. Understanding beginning to dawn. The rules are our survival protocol. They were developed through trial and error over decades of operation. Every rule represents lives lost, mistakes made, boundaries crossed with fatal consequences. He pulled out his own copy of the laminated sheet, worn soft from handling. The previous maintenance staff, all of them, they thought they knew better. They thought the rules were superstition or bureaucratic overreach. What happened to them? They became part of it. The cold takes what violates the boundaries, incorporates them into its structure. James isn't dead, Maya. He's worse than dead. He's become an extension of something ancient and hungry that sees human consciousness as just another form of energy to be harvested. I thought about the scratches on the walls, the impossible ice formations, the whispers in James's radio. Why don't you evacuate? Why keep operating? Dr. Hahn laughed bitterly. Because containment isn't passive. The facility doesn't just monitor the entity, it holds it in check. The electromagnetic fields generated by our equipment, the specific frequency signatures of our monitoring stations, even the heat output from our daily activities, creates a barrier that keeps it dormant. If we abandon this place, if the systems shut down, it would be free. The Tunguska event was caused by something similar breaking containment in Siberian permafrost. We estimate that this entity is considerably larger and more developed. He met my eyes. The rules aren't just protecting us, Maya, they're protecting the world. We stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of this revelation settling over me like a heavy blanket. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the building's structure with unusual violence. The wildlife, I said suddenly, remembering rule number 4. Don't make contact with local wildlife. What's that about? Dr. Hahn's expression darkened. The entity can extend its influence through any living thing that ventures too close to its primary mass. Arctic foxes, seals, even birds, they become scouts, extensions of its sensory network. Make contact with them, and you're making contact with it. How do you know all this? How can you be certain? Because I've seen what happens when people don't follow the rules. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Maya, I need you to understand something. The previous maintenance technician who disappeared, T. Morrison, he was James's older brother. This job posting wasn't random. James came here looking for answers about Tommy's disappearance. The implications of this hit me like a physical blow. James knew this place was dangerous. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. He thought he could solve the mystery through rational investigation and skeptical inquiry. Dr. Hahn's voice was heavy with regret. His brother had the same personality. Brilliant, confident, certain that any problem could be solved through proper application of scientific method. Both of them are gone now. Both of them are part of it now. And as long as you're here, Maya, as long as you work in this facility, you're walking a tightrope over an abyss. The rules are the only thing keeping you from falling. He opened the door, then looked back at me one final time. The entity tests boundaries constantly. It learns from each encounter, adapts its approaches, becomes more sophisticated in its attempts to breach the containment protocols. It will try to convince you that the rules are unnecessary, that you're strong enough or smart enough to handle whatever lies beyond them. What should I do? Follow the rules absolutely. Never venture beyond the station perimeter after sunset. Never investigate sounds in the halls at night. If the temperature drops below 40 degrees C in any area, seal it off immediately. And above all, never make contact with anything that approaches from outside. Dr. Hahn stepped into the hallway, then spoke once more without turning around. The helicopter will return in 5 months, weather permitting. Until then, survival is a matter of absolute adherence to protocols. The entity is patient, Maya. It can wait decades for the right moment to expand its influence. Don't give it that moment. After he left, I remained in the storage room for nearly an hour processing everything he'd told me. The building around me no longer felt like a research facility. It felt like a fortress under siege, its walls all that stood between something ancient and hungry and an unsuspecting world beyond the Arctic wastes. That night, I heard footsteps in the halls again. But this time I also heard voices. James's voice calling my name, asking for help. The sound came from the direction of the northern wing, muffled but unmistakably real. I pressed my hands over my ears and repeated the rules like a mantra until the voices finally stopped. The blizzard began on a Tuesday morning in late November, arriving with such sudden ferocity that it seemed to materialize from nothing. One moment the sky was its usual overcast grey. The next, walls of snow were battering the observatory's windows with hurricane force. The meteorological equipment registered wind speeds of 95 meters per hour and a temperature drop of 40 degrees in less than 2 hours. Marcus Webb, monitoring communications equipment in the main building, lost contact with the outside world within minutes of the storm's arrival. Atmospheric interference is off the charts, he reported to Dr. Hahn. Whatever's causing this is unlike any weather pattern I've seen. I was performing routine maintenance on the main building's heating system when the power fluctuations began. The lights flickered in irregular patterns, and several critical systems began cycling on and off without apparent cause. Most concerning was the heating system's behavior. Despite running continuously, the building's internal temperature was dropping steadily. By evening, the thermostats throughout the facility read 15 degrees C, well below the normal comfort range, but still within survivable parameters. The northern wing, predictably, had become completely uninhabitable. The temperature gauge at its entrance showed 50.2 degrees C, and frost was forming on the interior surfaces of the connecting corridor. We gathered in the main hall for dinner, huddling around portable heaters, while the storm raged outside. Sarah Chen looked particularly shaken, her hands trembling as she tried to eat soup that kept cooling too rapidly in her bowl. "How long do storms like this typically last?" I asked Dr. Han. "This isn't typical," he replied grimly. "I've never seen atmospheric conditions change this rapidly. It's as if the storm is being generated from beneath the ground rather than from normal weather patterns." Marcus looked up from his radio equipment. "I'm picking up some strange signals. Very low frequency, almost subsonic. They seem to be emanating from somewhere directly below us." As if summoned by his words, a deep vibration began resonating through the building's structure. It wasn't sound exactly, but something felt rather than heard, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. The portable heaters flickered in unison with each pulse. "It's waking up," Dr. Han said quietly. "The storm, the temperature drop, the electromagnetic interference. This is what happens when the entity becomes more active. Our containment systems are being overwhelmed." The vibration intensified, and suddenly every light in the facility went out simultaneously. Emergency power kicked in after several seconds, bathing us in dim red light that made everything look like a scene from a horror film. That's when we heard the banging. It came from outside, loud and rhythmic, as if someone was pounding on the building's exterior walls. But the sound moved, starting from the northern wing, traveling along the building's perimeter toward the main entrance, then circling back. Whatever was making the noise was walking around the facility's entire circumference. "Maya," the voice was faint but unmistakable. James's voice, calling from somewhere outside in the howling storm. "Maya, please. I'm so cold. I need help. Please let me in." My blood froze. The voice was coming from directly outside the main hall's windows, clear and distinct, despite the storm's fury. It sounded exactly like James, not distorted or unnatural, but perfectly, heartbreakingly familiar. "Maya, it's me. I'm hurt. The storm. I got lost, but I found my way back. Please, I can't feel my hands anymore." Sarah started to stand, her face filled with hope and concern. "That's James. He's alive!" Dr. Han grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "No, it's not James. How can you say that?" she demanded. "We have to help him." The banging intensified, and now we could hear scratching sounds, long deliberate scrapes against the building's metal siding. The voice came again, closer to the windows now, pleading and desperate. "Maya, I can see you in there. Why won't you help me? I thought we were friends. I'm dying out here." I stood up, my legs trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to open the door, to bring James inside where it was warm and safe. The rational part of my mind knew what Dr. Han had told me about the entity's capabilities, but hearing James's voice, so real, so frightened, made all of that feel like abstract theory. It's using his vocal patterns, Dr. Han said firmly. The entity absorbed him. It has access to his memories, his speech patterns, even his emotional responses. But James is gone, Maya. What's outside isn't human anymore. You don't know that for certain, I said, moving toward the window. What if you're wrong? What if he somehow survived, and we're letting him freeze to death because of paranoid theories? The voice outside shifted, becoming more urgent. Maya, please. The cold is getting worse. I can see something moving in the storm, something big. It's coming for me. You have to let me in now. Rule number 7 echoed in my mind. If you hear voices calling from outside after dark, do not respond. But this wasn't just any voice. This was someone I'd worked with, someone who'd disappeared because I hadn't been able to stop him from breaking the rules. I'm going to look, I announced, moving toward the window. Maya, no. Dr. Han lunged forward, but I was already pulling back the curtain. The storm was a wall of white chaos, but through it, I could make out a figure standing in the snow just beyond the building's perimeter. It was human-shaped, wearing what looked like James's winter jacket, but something was wrong with its proportions. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung at unnatural angles. As I watched, it waved at me with a gesture that was perfectly, recognizably James, the same casual salute he'd given me on his first day. Maya, I can see you. The voice was definitely coming from the figure, but its mouth wasn't moving in sync with the words. Please, just open the door for a second. I promise I'm okay. I just need to get warm. The figure stepped closer, and in the intermittent glow of the emergency lighting, I could see its face more clearly. It was James's face, or a close approximation of it. The features were correct, but the skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and the eyes reflected light like mirrors. Frost covered its hair and clothing, but the frost was moving, shifting in patterns that reminded me of the ice formations I'd seen in the northern wing. Maya. The voice was changing now, becoming less human with each word. Maya, let me in. I'm so cold, so cold. Let me in, let me in, let me in. The figure's face began to stretch, features elongating as if the flesh was plastic being pulled by invisible hands. The mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, revealing not teeth but crystalline structures that gleamed in the stormlight. I jerked back from the window, my heart hammering. It's not him, I whispered. It's definitely not him. The banging stopped suddenly. The voice stopped. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if the world was holding its breath. In the absolute silence, we could hear something else, a low, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the building itself was respiring. Then, impossibly, the temperature inside the main hall began to drop rapidly. Our breath became visible, then the emergency lights began to flicker and dim. Frost started forming on the windows, but not random frost, organized. Deliberate patterns that spelled out words in letters that hurt to look at directly. Let me in. The building shuddered, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of metal tearing. The entity wasn't just outside anymore, it was trying to get inside, using James's form and voice as a key to unlock our defenses. Dr. Han grabbed the emergency radio. All personnel to the central safe room. Immediate lockdown protocol. This is not a drill. As we gathered our essential supplies and prepared to retreat to the facility's most secure location, I couldn't stop thinking about the choice I'd almost made. I'd been seconds away from opening that door, from responding to the voice that sounded so much like someone I'd failed to save. The rules weren't just protection protocols. They were the only thing standing between us and something that could perfectly mimic human behavior, while remaining utterly, monstrously inhuman. And now it knew that I'd been tempted to break them. The safe room was located in the facility's basement level, accessible through a reinforced steel door that Dr. Han sealed behind us with an electronic lock requiring his biometric signature. The space was cramped but functional. Emergency supplies, backup power systems, and communication equipment designed to operate independently of the main building's infrastructure. According to the posted specifications, it could sustain 4 people for up to 2 weeks. We wouldn't last 2 hours. The temperature in the safe room was dropping just as rapidly as it had in the main hall above. Within minutes of sealing ourselves inside, Our breath was visible, and frost began forming on the concrete walls in those same organic, neural patterns I'd seen throughout the facility. The entity's influence was seeping through supposedly impervious barriers as if they were made of paper. "The containment systems are failing," Dr. Hahn said, monitoring readings on a bank of instruments. "Electromagnetic barriers are down to 30% capacity. Thermal regulation is completely offline. Whatever we disturbed by breaking protocol, it's accelerating the entity's awakening process." Marcus worked frantically at the radio equipment, trying to raise any outside contact. "Nothing," he reported. "Not even static. It's like the entire electromagnetic spectrum has gone dead." Sarah sat in the corner, wrapped in an emergency blanket, her face pale with shock. "This is really happening, isn't it? There's actually something under the ice and it's trying to kill us." The walls around us groaned and settled, but not in the normal way buildings respond to temperature changes. These sounds were organic, rhythmic, like breathing or a massive heartbeat. The frost patterns on the walls began to pulse in synchronization with the sounds, creating a hypnotic visual rhythm that was difficult to look away from. Then the voice returned. Not from outside this time, but from the facility's intercom system. "Maya." James's voice, perfectly clear despite the system being powered down. "Maya, I'm in the northern wing. I'm trapped and I'm hurt. The door is frozen shut from the outside. You're the only one who can reach the manual override." Dr. Hahn immediately moved to the intercom controls, but they were dark, completely without power. Yet James's voice continued, coming from speakers that shouldn't have been able to function. "Maya, please. I know you can hear me. The thing that was outside, it wasn't me, but I'm really here now, trapped in the monitoring station. The entity, it's growing stronger, but I found something. I found a way to stop it. But I need your help to activate the containment systems manually." My hands were shaking as I stared at the dead intercom system. The voice sounded so convincing, so desperate and human, but I'd seen the thing outside wearing James's face, watched it stretch and distort into something impossible. "It's lying," Dr. Hahn said firmly. "The entity can mimic voices, create auditory illusions. James has been gone for weeks." "Maya," the voice continued, "I know how this sounds. I know you saw something outside that looked like me, but that was the entity trying to trick you. I've been hiding in the northern wing, surviving on emergency rations, trying to figure out how to fight this thing. The manual containment controls are in the sub-basement level, beneath the northern wing. If someone doesn't activate them in the next few hours, the entity will break free completely." The safe room's temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Ice was now forming on our clothing, and the emergency heaters were struggling to produce any warmth at all. "Maya, listen to me carefully. There's a maintenance tunnel that connects this safe room to the northern wing's sub-basement. It's not on any of the official building plans. It was part of the original containment construction. Dr. Hahn knows about it. Ask him about the tunnel, Maya. Ask him why he's never mentioned it." I turned to Dr. Hahn, whose face had gone completely white. "Is there a tunnel?" He was quiet for several seconds. "Yes," he finally admitted. "But it's been sealed for years. Accessing it would be suicide. Why didn't you tell me about it?" "Because it leads directly to the entity's primary containment chamber. The original researchers used it to monitor the thing directly, but everyone who went down there..." He shuddered. "The tunnel exists, but using it would mean certain death." James's voice returned, more urgent now. "Maya, he's lying to you. The tunnel is the only way to reach the manual controls. The entity is feeding him false information, making him believe the tunnel is dangerous when it's actually our only hope. You have to trust me." The frost patterns on the walls were becoming more complex, forming symbols and diagrams that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Some of the patterns looked almost like maps or schematics, showing pathways through the building that didn't match the official architectural plans. "Maya," James's voice was becoming distorted now, taking on harmonic overtones that resonated painfully in my skull. "Maya, the tunnel entrance is behind the power distribution panel on the east wall. But you have to hurry. The entity is almost fully awakened, and once it breaks through to the surface, it will spread across the entire Arctic ecosystem." I looked at the east wall, where a large electrical panel was mounted. The frost patterns surrounding it were different from the others, more organized, more deliberate, forming what looked almost like an arrow pointing toward the panel's location. "Don't listen to it," Dr. Hahn pleaded. "Maya, Everything it's telling you is designed to lure you into its domain. There are no manual containment controls. The tunnel leads directly to the entity itself. If you go down there, you'll become part of it, just like James did. The building above us began to shake violently, as if something massive was moving through its structure. The lights flickered and went out entirely, leaving us in darkness broken only by the eerie phosphorescent glow of the frost patterns on the walls. In the darkness, James's voice changed again, becoming layered, multiplied, as if spoken by dozens of mouths simultaneously. Maya, 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 come to us, come to us, come to us. We are cold, we are hungry, we are lonely, we need. The voice dissolved into static, then silence. But in that silence I could hear something else. A rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from behind the electrical panel. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. SOS. Someone or something was trapped behind that wall trying to communicate. I had to make a choice. Trust Dr. Han's warnings and stay in the safe room while the entity grew stronger around us, or trust the voice that might be James and venture into tunnels that might lead to salvation or certain doom. The tapping behind the wall continued, desperate and rhythmic. In the phosphorescent glow of the frost patterns, I could see that the electrical panel's securing bolts had frozen solid, but they were already beginning to loosen as the ice expanded and contracted. Whatever was behind that wall was trying to get out, and I had to decide whether to let it. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. The phosphorescent frost patterns on the walls pulsed once brilliantly, then faded to a dim glow that barely illuminated our frozen breath. For several minutes the only sounds were our labored breathing and the distant groaning of the building's structure under impossible stresses. Then the temperature began to rise. It happened gradually at first, the edge taken off the brutal cold that had been seeping into our bones. The frost on the walls started to sublimate, creating small clouds of vapor that drifted through the safe room like ghosts. Within an hour, the emergency heaters were actually producing warmth, and we could speak without our words crystallizing in the air. "It's over," Dr. Han said quietly, checking his instruments. "The electromagnetic containment systems are coming back online. Thermal regulation is stabilizing." Whatever was happening, it stopped. Marcus managed to raise a weak signal on the emergency radio. Through bursts of static, we could hear normal weather reports from stations hundreds of miles away. The impossible storm that had engulfed our facility was dissipating, leaving behind clear skies and normal Arctic temperatures. We emerged from the safe room to find the facility transformed. The northern wing remained sealed and frozen, but the rest of the building was returning to habitable conditions. The lights functioned normally, the heating systems hummed with mechanical regularity, and the oppressive atmosphere of dread that had permeated every corridor was gone. But something fundamental had changed. I noticed it first in the mirrors. My reflection looked wrong somehow, not obviously distorted, but subtly off in ways that made my skin crawl. The proportions of my face seemed slightly different, the color of my eyes a shade too pale. When I mentioned this to the others, they looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "You look fine, Maya," Sarah said, but her voice carried an odd, flat quality. "We all look fine." Dr. Han was examining readouts from the containment monitoring systems, his face creased with confusion. "According to these instruments, the entity has returned to dormancy. All systems show normal baseline readings, but—" He paused, studying the data more carefully. "The energy signature is different. Weaker in some ways, but more distributed, as if parts of it have moved to new locations. Over the following days, I began to notice other changes. My appetite had decreased significantly. Food tasted wrong, too warm, lacking the crisp coldness I found myself craving. I slept poorly, disturbed by dreams of vast ice formations and whispered conversations in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Most disturbing were the windows. Looking outside, the Arctic landscape appeared normal during the day. Endless white expanses, gray skies, the occasional Arctic fox or seal in the distance, but at night I could see figures moving in the snow, tall, pale shapes that walked upright but moved with fluid, inhuman grace. They maintained their distance from the facility, never approaching closer than the original perimeter markers, but they were always there, watching. Sometimes I recognized them. James was among them, his winter jacket still visible but his movements wrong, too smooth and deliberate. I thought I saw T. Morrison as well, based on the maintenance uniform, though his face was too distant to make out clearly. Others I didn't recognize. Researchers, technicians, visitors who had violated the rules over the decades of the facility's operation. They had become something else. Not dead, not exactly alive, but incorporated into the entity's distributed consciousness. They were its eyes and ears, its scouts in the world above the ice. Dr. Hahn found me at my window one night, watching the figures patrol the perimeter. "You can see them too," he said. It wasn't a question. How many are there? 43, according to our records. Everyone who disappeared from the facility over the past 37 years. He joined me at the window, his face grim. They're not confined to the immediate area anymore. Satellite imagery shows similar figures appearing at remote locations across the Arctic Circle. The entity is expanding its influence. What does that mean for us? I think we're still alive because we followed the rules when it mattered most. But we've been marked, changed. We're part of its network now, whether we want to be or not. He showed me a data pad with medical readings. Our body temperatures have dropped 2 degrees below normal. Our metabolic rates have slowed. We're adapting to the cold in ways that shouldn't be physiologically possible. I looked at my hands, noticing for the first time that they no longer felt cold even when touching metal surfaces that should have been freezing. My skin had taken on a slightly translucent quality, and I could see the network of blood vessels beneath the surface more clearly than before. "Are we going to end up like them?" I asked, nodding toward the figures outside. "I don't know. The transformation seems to be gradual, and it might be reversible if we can get away from the facility's influence, but—" He paused, looking out at the watching figures. "I've been here 11 years, Maya. I've felt the changes happening slowly, and I've never been able to leave. Something keeps drawing me back, making excuses to extend my assignment, to delay my departure. The rescue helicopter was scheduled to arrive in 3 months. As that date approached, I found myself making my own excuses. The northern wing needed additional maintenance before I could safely leave the facility. The backup power systems required optimization. There were equipment failures that only I had the expertise to repair. All lies, of course. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. I no longer wanted to leave. The facility felt like home now. The cold didn't bother me anymore. The whispers I heard in the halls at night sounded like conversations with old friends. The figures outside the windows seemed welcoming rather than threatening. And sometimes, late at night, I found myself standing at the entrance to the northern wing, my hand on the door handle, listening to voices that called my name with perfect, loving familiarity. The rules still protected us, but they had also become our prison. We were alive, but we were no longer entirely human. We had survived the entity's awakening, but in doing so we had become its newest instruments. The helicopter would come. Other maintenance personnel would be assigned to the facility. Fresh faces, untainted by prolonged exposure, would receive their own laminated rule sheets and their own warnings about the dangers of the Arctic environment. And we would watch from the windows, pale figures in the snow, as the cycle began again. The helicopter arrived on schedule, its rotors cutting through the clear Arctic air like mechanical blades. I watched from my window as it touched down in the designated landing area, its orange fuselage bright against the endless white landscape. The pilot was different this time, a young woman with short blonde hair and confident movements that spoke of military training. She wasn't alone. 2 figures emerged from the passenger compartment, a maintenance technician carrying a heavy toolkit, and a young researcher with eager eyes and multiple degrees that wouldn't help him survive what was coming. The maintenance tech was David Chen, Sarah's younger brother, here because she'd recommended him for the position during her last communication with the outside world. The researcher was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the Dr. Walsh who had frozen solid in her laboratory in 2017, just another Jennifer Walsh drawn to the facility by the same combination of scientific curiosity and career ambition. Dr. Hahn greeted them with practiced efficiency, the same routine I'd experienced months earlier. Facility orientation, safety briefings, room assignments, and, of course, the laminated sheet of rules that they would read with the same mixture of amusement and skepticism that I had once felt. I remained in my quarters during the orientation. but I could hear their voices through the building's ventilation system. David Chen laughed when Dr. Han explained about not investigating footsteps in the halls at night. Dr. Walsh made jokes about primitive superstitions in the age of modern science. They would learn, just as I had learned. Just as everyone learned eventually. Sarah approached me that evening as I stood at my window, watching the figures move through the snow beyond the perimeter. The patrol had grown larger since my arrival, 45 shapes now, including 2 recent additions that I didn't want to think about too carefully. "David's settling in well," she said, her voice carrying that same flat quality that had become normal for all of us. "He's excited about the work. He looks like you," I replied. "Same facial structure, same mannerisms. The entity will find that useful." Sarah nodded without surprise or horror. We had moved beyond such emotions months ago. Dr. Walsh is already planning modifications to the monitoring equipment. She thinks our current systems are outdated, insufficient for proper scientific observation. She'll want to access the northern wing. Of course she will. They always do. Through the window I could see one of the figures approaching closer to the building than usual. It moved with James's characteristic gait, but its face was turned upward toward our window. Even at this distance, I could see its eyes reflecting the facility's lights like mirrors. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. "The rules will hold them for a while," Sarah continued. "David is cautious by nature, and Dr. Walsh is thorough in her research methods. But eventually, they'll encounter something that challenges their rationality. A temperature anomaly, an equipment malfunction, voices in the halls that shouldn't exist, and then they'll have to choose between following rules they don't understand or investigating phenomena that defy logical explanation." Sarah's reflection in the window looked normal to me now, though I knew that to outside observers, we would all appear subtly wrong. The entity is patient. It can wait for the right moment, the right combination of curiosity and desperation. The next morning, I found the new rule sheet that Dr. Han had prepared for David and Dr. Walsh. It was identical to the one I'd received, with one addition. If long-term facility personnel seem different or offer advice that contradicts official protocols, do not follow their guidance. A smart addition. Dr. Han had learned from experience that the entity's influence could work through those of us who had been changed by prolonged exposure. We were no longer entirely trustworthy, though we maintained enough human consciousness to feel regret about this fact. David found me in the equipment storage room that afternoon, looking for spare parts for a heating unit repair. He was tall and lean like Sarah, with the same quick movements and analytical mind. "Maya, right? Sarah's told me about you. Says you've kept this place running smoothly despite some unusual challenges." I studied his face, memorizing the features that would soon become familiar to the watchers outside. "The challenges are manageable if you follow proper procedures." "About those rules," he pulled out his laminated sheet, grinning. "Some of these seem pretty extreme. Don't investigate footsteps in the halls at night. I mean, part of my job is investigating unusual sounds. That's how you identify equipment problems before they become critical failures. The rules exist for good reasons. David, trust me on this. I'm sure they do. But I've worked in remote facilities before. Industrial sites, oil platforms, mining operations. You develop protocols based on real hazards, not superstitions." He folded the rules and tucked them into his jacket pocket. "I respect the need for safety measures, but I'm not going to let paranoid theories prevent me from doing my job effectively." I watched him walk away, his confident stride identical to James's on that first day. The entity was already studying him, learning his patterns, preparing its approaches. Within weeks, it would know exactly how to manipulate his professional pride and rational skepticism. That night, I heard familiar sounds from the northern wing, footsteps in the sealed corridors, voices calling through the locked doors. But now the voices included new ones, practicing David's speech patterns and Dr. Walsh's precise academic tone. The entity was preparing, rehearsing for the performances that would eventually lure them beyond the protection of the rules. Dr. Han found me in the hallway, listening to the sounds from the northern wing. "How long do you think they'll last?" I asked. "Dr. Walsh will probably make it through the winter. She's methodical, careful about following established protocols even when she doesn't understand them. David..." He paused, considering. "David reminds me too much of James. same personality type, same confidence in his ability to solve problems through rational analysis. 3 months, maybe 4. And then there will be 47 figures outside instead of 45, unless they're smarter than their predecessors. Unless they learn to value survival over curiosity. But we both knew they wouldn't. The entity had been selecting its victims for decades, drawing exactly the type of people who would eventually challenge boundaries and test limits. Brilliant, curious, confident individuals who believed that knowledge could overcome any obstacle, the type of people who would break the rules. I returned to my quarters and prepared for sleep. Though sleep had become something different for us, a state of reduced consciousness, during which we remained dimly aware of the facility's activities and the movements of the watchers outside. As I lay in bed, I could hear Dr. Walsh working late in her laboratory, adjusting equipment and taking measurements. Tomorrow, she would begin to notice anomalies in the data. Temperature fluctuations that didn't match weather patterns, electromagnetic readings that suggested impossible energy sources beneath the facility. Her scientific training would demand investigation, explanation, understanding, and the entity would be waiting, patient as winter itself, ready to teach her that some knowledge came at a price too terrible to pay. The cycle would continue. New faces, new voices, new additions to the patrol that circled our facility in the endless Arctic night. We were all part of it now, the watchers and the watched, the hunters and the hunted, bound together by rules that protected us, only as long as we remembered that some boundaries should never be crossed. Outside my window, James waved again, his gesture welcoming and patient. There was always room for more in the cold.